The coffee in my cup had gone cold hours ago while I sat in that parking garage, staring at my phone screen showing 31 missed calls just 3 days earlier. David Chen had looked me straight in the eye and told me I wasn't ready for a leadership role. Now everyone at Meridian Technologies was calling me like the servers had caught fire. My name's Ryan Mitchell. I'm 47 years old, and until that conversation with my boss, I thought I knew exactly where my career was heading. Turns out I was wrong about a lot of things. I've been at Meridian Technologies for 7 years now. Before that, I spent 15 years in the Air Force, handling network infrastructure and cybersecurity operations. When you're responsible for keeping communications secure across 3 continents, you learn pretty quick that details matter. Every system, every protocol, every redundancy plan, they all have to work perfectly or missions fail. That mindset served me well in corporate America, maybe too well. When I started at Meridian, the IT infrastructure department was a complete disaster. My predecessor had left without any documentation, no network diagrams, no password repositories, nothing. It was like walking into a data center where someone had unplugged all the servers and removed all the labels. I spent 3 weeks just figuring out what systems we actually had and how they connected to each other. Nobody could tell me which servers supported which applications. Nobody knew where the backup configurations were stored. Nobody understood why certain firewall rules existed or what would break if they were changed. I spent the first 8 months rebuilding everything from scratch, working until 1 a.m. most nights, coming in on weekends, mapping out every network connection, and creating detailed runbooks for everything. I built a complete documentation library with diagrams, procedures, troubleshooting guides, and disaster recovery plans. My daughter Emma was only 8 then. This was about 4 years after my wife, Michelle, passed from a car accident. And I remember her asking why Daddy was always at work. I'd look at her little face and promise that it would get better soon, that Daddy just needed to fix some things, and then we'd have more time together. But it never got better. There was always another crisis, another system failure, another client emergency. But I thought it would pay off eventually. That's what they tell you, right? Work hard, keep your head down, and you'll get recognized. Put in the extra effort and opportunities will come. For 7 years, I was the guy who made sure everything ran smoothly. When our biggest client, Sterling Financial, had critical system failures, I was the one who stayed until 3 a.m. to restore their services. I remember one Christmas Eve when their trading platform crashed, and I spent 8 hours in the server room while Emma waited at home with her grandmother. When networks crashed, I fixed them. When security breaches happened, I contained them. When vendors failed to deliver, I found workarounds. When impossible deadlines appeared, I somehow made them possible. I created disaster recovery procedures, documented every network topology, and basically became the institutional memory of the entire IT department. If something broke and nobody knew how to fix it, they called Ryan. If a client had a weird configuration that nobody understood, they asked Ryan. If a project was behind schedule and needed a miracle, they gave it to Ryan. I never said no. I never pushed back. I never asked for credit or recognition. I just did the work because that's who I am. That's what the Air Force taught me. Mission first, ego second. David Chen became my boss about 4 years ago. Nice enough guy. About 43, very focused on the strategic vision stuff. The problem was, he never bothered to learn any of the actual technical systems. Why would he? I had everything running so smoothly that he could focus on executive presentations and budget meetings. What I didn't know was that David had other plans for the department. His nephew Brandon had just graduated with a master's in information systems from MIT. 24 years old, smart kid, but he'd never worked a day in enterprise IT, never handled a production outage at 2 a.m., never had to explain to an angry CEO why their email was down, never had to rebuild a compromised network from nothing. If you're enjoying this story so far, hit that like button and subscribe. We post new stories every day. And trust me, the revenge in this one is worth sticking around for. Drop a comment about what you think Ryan should do next. The promotion meeting happened on a Wednesday. I'd spent the previous weekend preparing a comprehensive presentation. Every metric, every achievement, every contribution documented with specifics. I wanted there to be no ambiguity about what I'd accomplished. The presentation showed how I'd improved system uptime from 92% to 99.7% over the past 3 years, how I'd reduced security incidents by 75% through better monitoring and faster response, how I'd personally managed the sterling financial infrastructure that generated $12 million in annual revenue, how I'd saved the company hundreds of thousands in emergency contractor fees by being available around the clock. I'd even included testimonials from clients who'd specifically praised my responsiveness and expertise. This was an airtight case, or so I thought. David flipped through my portfolio for maybe 6 minutes before setting it aside. He barely glanced at the metrics. He didn't ask a single question about the achievements. "I appreciate everything you've done, Ryan," he said, not really looking at me. "But I've been thinking about the direction of this department. We need fresh perspectives, new approaches to cloud migration. Brandon will be joining us next month as Senior Infrastructure Architect." Senior Infrastructure Architect. That was the position I'd been working toward for 7 years, the role that would finally recognize what I actually contributed, the title that matched the work I was already doing. I felt like I'd been punched in the stomach, but I kept my voice steady. "I see. And where does that leave me?" "You'll continue in your current role. Brandon will need someone experienced to help him understand our systems, someone to show him how everything works, someone experienced to help him understand our systems." Translation. I'd do all the work while his nephew got the title and the salary bump. I'd train my own replacement while being passed over for a kid with 0 experience. I kept my expression neutral, the way they taught us in the Air Force. Never let them see you react. Never give them ammunition. "I understand. Thank you for the feedback." "Great. I'm glad we're on the same page. Brandon starts Monday, so maybe you can prepare some onboarding documentation over the weekend. You know, the key systems, the critical contacts, the things he'll need to hit the ground running." That's when something clicked for me. I'd been working weekends for 7 years. I'd missed Emma's soccer games, school plays, parent-teacher conferences. I'd given this company everything, and they wanted me to spend my weekend preparing to train my replacement. I stood up, shook David's hand, and walked out of his office. But instead of going back to my desk, I walked straight to the parking garage. That's where I made the decision that changed everything. I wasn't going to quit in anger. I wasn't going to storm out or make a scene. That would just confirm whatever narrative David was building about me being difficult or not a team player. I was going to do something much more effective. I was going to follow my job description exactly as written. See, here's what David and the executives didn't understand. There's a massive gap in most organizations between what your job description says and what you actually do. For most people, especially dedicated people, that gap gets filled with extra effort, unofficial responsibilities, and going above and beyond. We do it because we care. We do it because it's the right thing. We do it because nobody else will. But that extra effort is invisible to people who don't look closely. They see the smooth results without understanding what creates them. They assume things just work without realizing someone is working themselves to death to make it look easy. My official job description was pretty basic. Maintain a T infrastructure within assigned scope. Coordinate with vendors as needed. Ensure system availability within operational parameters. Standard corporate language that didn't come close to describing what I actually did every day. What I actually did was arrive at 6:30 a.m. to check overnight monitoring alerts and resolve any issues before David's 8 a.m. status calls. I reviewed security logs for anomalies. I checked backup completion reports. I verified that all critical systems were functioning properly, all before anyone else arrived. I answered support tickets for 4 different departments because somehow I'd become the go-to guy for any technical question. Database issues, ask Ryan. Network problems, ask Ryan. Software not working, ask Ryan. Application errors, ask Ryan. I solved problems before they became crises, staying late to patch systems and prevent outages. I proactively monitored for issues that might cause problems tomorrow. I maintained relationships with vendors who could expedite help when we needed it. I documented solutions so that theoretically anyone could follow them. But my job description said 8 to 5. So that's what I was going to do. Not 1 minute early, not 1 minute late. Exactly what they were paying me for, nothing more. I drove home that Wednesday evening and did something I hadn't done in years. I turned off my work phone at 5:15 p.m. The silence was strange. For 7 years, that phone had been like an extension of my body, always checking for alerts, always watching for client escalations, always ready to jump into action. Turning it off felt like removing a limb, but it also felt liberating. For the first time in years, I wasn't waiting for the next crisis. I wasn't mentally running through worst-case scenarios. I was just a dad, driving home to his daughter. Emma was shocked when I walked in the door at 5:45 instead of 8 or 9. "Dad, why are you home so early? Is everything okay?" I decided my time was more valuable than I realized. I told her, "Want to play some video games before dinner?" Her face lit up like Christmas morning. She literally jumped up from the couch and ran to get the controllers. We played for 2 hours straight, laughing and competing and just being together. I couldn't remember the last time I'd done that. Over dinner, Emma told me about school, about her friends, about the boy who sat next to her in science class. Things I'd been missing because I was always distracted, always thinking about work, always half present, even when I was physically home. That night, I slept better than I had in months. No anxiety about what might go wrong overnight. No mental rehearsal of tomorrow's crises. Just peaceful sleep. Thursday morning, I arrived at exactly 8 a.m. No checking overnight alerts. No getting ahead of the day's issues. I made coffee, settled into my desk, and started working on my assigned tickets at a normal pace. I answered tickets assigned directly to me and escalated everything else to the appropriate teams. When my phone rang with questions about configurations that weren't technically my responsibility, I politely directed callers to the service desk. When someone sent me an urgent email about a cross-department issue, I forwarded it to the relevant team leads. By lunch, people were starting to notice. Karen from accounting stopped by my desk with a confused expression. "Ryan, did you see the alert about the Sterling Financial Database replication lag I did?" I replied, continuing to work on my assigned server maintenance ticket. So, can you fix it like you usually do? That's actually a database administration issue. I forwarded it to the DBA team. They'll need to investigate the root cause. Her eyebrows went up. But you always handle these cross-system issues. I've been advised to focus more on my core responsibilities, just trying to be more efficient with my time. The look of confusion on Karen's face told me everything I needed to know. Nobody had ever bothered to understand what my actual job was supposed to be versus what I'd been doing all these years. By Friday, the cracks were really starting to show. The sterling financial issue had escalated because the DBA team couldn't figure out the network dependency I'd normally diagnose in 15 minutes. 4 other clients had routine requests sitting in various queues because nobody knew the proper troubleshooting procedures. The help desk was overwhelmed with tickets they couldn't resolve. Managers were sending angry emails demanding answers nobody could provide. I watched it all unfold with the detached interest of someone observing a science experiment. Every ticket that sat unresolved, every alert that went unacknowledged, every urgent request that nobody could handle. It was all documented in my comprehensive runbook library that apparently nobody had ever bothered to read. 7 years of documentation, hundreds of procedures, detailed troubleshooting guides for every scenario I'd ever encountered, all sitting in the shared drive, gathering digital dust, because everyone found it easier to just ask Ryan. The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd created all this documentation specifically so the company wouldn't be dependent on any single person. But instead of using it, they'd become dependent on me, and leadership had never noticed or cared about the difference. Marcus from the network team wandered by my desk around 2 p.m. looking frazzled. His shirt was untucked, his hair was disheveled, and he looked like he hadn't slept. Ryan, the VPN cluster is throwing authentication errors for remote users. Half the sales team can't connect to their applications. Can you work your magic what seems to be the specific issue? The Radius integration is failing intermittently, and nobody can figure out why. We've had 3 engineers looking at it all morning. I nodded thoughtfully. That configuration is documented in the Network Runbook, Section 14. The troubleshooting steps require checking the certificate chain and the load balancer health checks. There's also a known issue with the timeout settings that can cause intermittent failures under load, but that'll take hours of investigation. The sales team is screaming. It's a complex integration. Security implementations usually are. That's why the documentation exists. Marcus stared at me like I'd grown a second head. You've always just fixed these things in 20 minutes. I had deep familiarity with these systems from years of experience, but with the department restructuring coming up, I thought it best to follow documented procedures so the new leadership can understand the environment. Otherwise, how will Brandon learn? He walked away, shaking his head, probably wondering when I'd become such a stickler for process. But I noticed he was carrying a printout of the runbook when he left. First time anyone had actually printed that document in years. Thursday evening, I was home by 5:20 p.m. Emma was working on a school project at the kitchen table when I walked in. Dad, can you help me with this coding assignment? For the first time in months, I actually had the mental energy to sit down and focus on her Python homework instead of thinking about production alerts. We spent an hour and a half working through loops and functions together, and I realized how much I'd missed these simple moments. You know, Dad, Emma said as we finished up, you seem different this week. Different? How? Less distracted? I guess. Like you're actually here when you're here. Smart kid. She'd noticed something I was just starting to understand myself. Monday morning brought the real crisis. I arrived at 8 a.m. to find chaos in full swing. David was pacing outside the conference room. Brandon was already there, looking overwhelmed with his MIT degree and zero production experience. And Victoria Hayes, our CTO, had apparently been called in for an emergency meeting. The receptionist flagged me down before I could reach my desk. "Ryan, they need you in the executive conference room immediately." I gathered my notebook and walked into what was clearly a full-scale disaster situation. Besides David, Brandon, and Victoria, there were two people I didn't recognize. Probably executives from the board. "Ryan," Victoria said with obvious relief, "thank God you're here. We've got a critical situation with Sterling Financial." "What's the specific issue?" David launched into an explanation. But it was clear he only understood about a quarter of the problem. Sterling's primary authentication system had failed, and their entire trading platform was down. Brandon was taking notes frantically, but kept asking basic questions that showed he had no understanding of our architecture. "Their trading desk has been offline for 2 hours. One of the board members said, "They're losing millions in transaction fees. They're threatening to terminate the contract and pursue damages if we can't resolve this by noon." I reviewed the issue details they'd gathered. It was actually a fairly straightforward problem. If you understood the system dependencies and had access to the right documentation. This appears to be a certificate expiration issue with their SSO integration. I said, "The resolution is documented in the Client Implementation Guide. Section 18. It requires coordinating changes across the identity provider, the load balancer, and the application servers in a specific sequence." Brandon was frantically searching through folders on his laptop. "Which documentation exactly?" Section 18, subsections 5 through 12. "The process takes about 4 hours if you follow the step-by-step procedures." Assuming no complications, Victoria leaned forward. "Can you handle this immediately?" I checked my watch. "I have the quarterly security audit scheduled at 9:30. That's required by our compliance framework and due to auditors by end of day, so it can't be rescheduled. The security audit can wait." David said quickly, "Sterling is our biggest client. I understand Sterling is critical. However, missing the audit deadline triggers automatic compliance violations and potential regulatory penalties. That would affect all our clients and our ability to operate. Not just Sterling." The room went silent. You could practically hear everyone calculating the implications. "What are our options?" Victoria asked carefully. "Well, Brandon could handle the Sterling issue using the documented procedures. It would be excellent hands-on experience for him. And I'd be available for questions between audit sessions." Brandon looked like a deer in headlights. I don't think I'm ready for something this critical. The documentation is very detailed," I said encouragingly. "Everything is laid out step by step, with screenshots and verification checkpoints. This is exactly the kind of real-world experience you'll need in your new role." David's face was getting red. "Ryan, we need you to fix this personally. I'm happy to take point on Sterling if you'd like me to reschedule the security audit. But I want to be clear about the compliance implications. We'd need to request an extension from the auditors, document the business justification, and accept any penalties for the delay." Victoria held up a hand. "Let's think this through. What would it take to handle both?" I considered the timeline. The security audit is scheduled in 90-minute blocks throughout the day. I could handle the most critical Sterling fixes between sessions. But the full resolution probably wouldn't be complete until after 6 p.m. That's cutting it very close with Sterling's deadline. That's a significant risk. The board member noted, "It is. In the past, I would have worked through the night to handle both simultaneously. But I've been reflecting on sustainable work practices lately. My daughter has a school awards ceremony tonight, that I've already missed twice this year. The silence was deafening. Victoria finally spoke. Ryan, let me be direct. What would it take for you to handle this crisis the way you always have? I looked around the room at the faces staring at me. These people had relied on my expertise for 7 years without ever acknowledging what I actually contributed. Now, suddenly, my work-life balance was their emergency. Well, I said slowly, I suppose we should discuss what my role actually is here. Your role is to solve technical problems, David said tersely. According to my job description, my role is to maintain infrastructure within assigned scope. The Sterling implementation falls under the Solutions Architecture team, which reports to a different department. The board member leaned forward. Are you saying you won't help? Not at all. I'm saying that if we want to resolve this properly, we need to clarify responsibilities and decision-making authority. Brandon is starting as Senior Infrastructure Architect on Monday. This seems like an excellent opportunity for him to demonstrate his capabilities. Brandon spoke up, his voice shaky. Ryan, I appreciate your confidence, but I'm genuinely not prepared for something this high stakes. I turned to him with genuine kindness. Brandon, you have a master's from MIT. You're intelligent, and you have strong theoretical foundations. The only difference between you and me is that I've seen these problems before, but every expert was once a beginner. But what if I make it worse? Then we'll fix it together. That's how you build real expertise. The documentation is comprehensive, and I'll be available for guidance. David was getting impatient. We don't have time for on-the-job training exercises. Actually, we do. I said, the Sterling issue isn't going anywhere in the next few hours. It's been building for weeks because nobody wanted to address the certificate renewal properly. A few more hours won't change the fundamental problem. Victoria studied me carefully. Ryan, it seems like something has changed in your approach this week. You're right. I've been doing some thinking about my career trajectory and what I want my legacy to be. And what conclusion did you reach? That I've been enabling a system that doesn't work. By constantly stepping in to solve problems outside my official role, I've prevented the company from building proper processes and developing other people's capabilities. I've also prevented leadership from understanding what it actually takes to keep this infrastructure running. The room was quiet, except for the hum of the HVAC system. Let me ask you something. I continued. What happens when I retire, or get sick, or decide to take that job offer from Apex Systems? The board member's eyes sharpened. What job offer? A competitor reached out last month. Director of Infrastructure, 40% salary increase, full remote flexibility, equity participation. I haven't responded yet because I've been loyal to Meridian. I wasn't lying. Apex had reached out, though I hadn't seriously considered their offer until this week. Victoria and the board member exchanged glances. David looked like he was going to be sick. Perhaps we should discuss this privately, Victoria said. Brandon, why don't you start reviewing the Sterling documentation with Ryan's guidance? Everyone else, let's step into my office. As Brandon and I walked to my desk, he seemed overwhelmed. Ryan, I want you to know I never asked my uncle to give me this position. I know you deserved it more than me. I stopped walking and looked at him. Brandon, you seem like a good kid. But here's the thing. This isn't about what you asked for or what anyone deserves. It's about what's best for the company and what's best for your career development. What do you mean if your uncle had promoted you into this role without proper preparation? You would have struggled publicly, not because you're incompetent, but because you don't have the experience yet. That kind of visible failure would have damaged your confidence and your professional reputation for years. Brandon nodded slowly. I hadn't thought about it that way. My uncle made it sound like basic project coordination. But looking at these runbooks, I can see there's way more complexity than I understood. Your uncle's not wrong that it involves coordination. But enterprise infrastructure is about understanding how all the pieces interact and what cascades when something fails. That only comes from experience. We worked through the Sterling resolution together. Brandon followed the documentation while I guided him through the decision points, explaining the reasoning behind each step. He was a quick learner, asking intelligent questions and taking detailed notes. By 2 p.m., Sterling's authentication system was restored, and their trading platform was back online. Brandon had a comprehensive understanding of the architecture and the troubleshooting methodology. "Ryan," he said as we wrapped up, "I have to be honest. I had no idea how much went into this job. My uncle described it as managing vendors and reviewing reports. Most executives don't understand the technical complexity underneath their business operations. That's not a criticism. It's just how specialization works. The problem comes when they make decisions about technical roles without that understanding." The meeting in Victoria's office lasted almost 3 hours. When it ended, Victoria came to find me personally. "Ryan, do you have a few minutes?" "Of course." She led me to her office and closed the door. "I owe you an apology. I should have paid closer attention to the organizational dynamics in David's department." I appreciated her directness. "What happens now? We've been having some difficult conversations. The board is concerned about the single point of failure risk you demonstrated this week. They're also concerned about the judgment involved in the original promotion decision." I nodded, but didn't respond. "I'd like to offer you the Director of Infrastructure position. New role, reporting directly to me. You'd have authority over the entire infrastructure organization, including David's team. We're also restructuring some responsibilities." "What about Brandon?" "He'll continue in a senior technical role, but as an individual contributor focused on cloud architecture projects. He'll have time to develop real expertise before taking on leadership responsibilities." "Honestly, I think he's relieved. And David will be transitioning to a strategic planning role. He's good at big picture thinking, but he needs to be in a position where he's not making decisions about technical capabilities he doesn't understand." I considered the offer carefully. This was everything I'd worked toward for 7 years: recognition, authority, the ability to build something meaningful. But I'd also learned some hard lessons this week about what I really wanted. "There's one thing I need to discuss. Apex Systems made me a competitive offer last week." Victoria nodded. "I figured as much. When you mentioned it, what would it take for you to stay?" I thought about Emma, about all the games I'd missed, all the homework sessions I'd been too tired to help with, all the bedtime stories I'd postponed because of work emergencies. I thought about what kind of father I wanted to be, what kind of life I wanted to build. A few things. First, I want full authority to build and develop talent internally. Too many good technical people get overlooked because they're not positioned for visibility. I've seen it happen over and over. People doing excellent work, never getting recognized because they're too busy working to play politics. Agreed, we need better talent development anyway. Second, I want to implement comprehensive documentation and cross-training standards. What happened this week should never happen again. No critical knowledge should exist only in one person's mind. It's bad for the company, and it's bad for the person who becomes a single point of failure. Also agreed. What else? Sustainable work expectations. I've been working 60+ hours a week for 7 years, missing my daughter's life. She's growing up without me really being present, even when I'm physically there. I want to build an organization that doesn't require people to sacrifice their families for their jobs. That doesn't reward burnout and call it dedication. Victoria smiled. That's actually better for the business long term anyway. Burned out employees make mistakes. High turnover destroys institutional knowledge. We should have addressed this years ago. Anything else? Just one thing. I want Brandon to succeed if this field is really what he wants. He's actually a smart kid with good instincts. He just needs proper development, but he needs to earn advancement through demonstrated competence, not family connections. That's better for him and better for the company. I think you'll find Brandon is more committed to learning than any of us expected. This week humbled him in a good way. He came to me privately and said he wanted to start over, build real expertise before taking on leadership. That takes character. The transition took about 8 weeks. I restructured the department around clear roles, documented responsibilities, and proper escalation paths instead of the informal system of whoever Ryan can fix it. Every process had an owner. Every system had documentation. Every team had cross-training requirements. I hired 3 excellent senior engineers who brought fresh perspectives while I provided the institutional knowledge they needed to be effective. I focused on hiring people who were smart, curious, and collaborative rather than just technically skilled. Technical skills can be taught. Character is harder to develop. Brandon turned out to be a dedicated learner. He worked harder than anyone expected, staying late, not because he had to, but because he genuinely wanted to understand the systems. He asked questions constantly, took detailed notes, and never pretended to know things he didn't. Within 4 months, he was handling complex projects independently and showing real potential. One day, he came to my office and thanked me for what I asked, for not letting me fail publicly. He said, for giving me time to actually learn this stuff. My uncle meant well, but he almost set me up to embarrass myself. That's when I knew he was going to be okay. The most surprising development was with David. Once he wasn't trying to manage technical decisions he didn't understand. He actually excelled at strategic planning. His big picture thinking, combined with the solid technical foundation we were building, helped the company land 3 major new contracts. He was happier too, doing work that actually matched his skills. 8 months later, I was working at a sustainable pace, home for dinner by 6 most nights, and present for all of Emma's remaining soccer games that season. My team was functioning independently. Clients were happy. And I finally felt like I was doing the job I'd always been capable of. The department had transformed. Instead of one person holding everything together through heroic effort, we had a real organization with real processes. When someone went on vacation, work continued smoothly. When issues arose, people knew exactly who to contact and what procedures to follow. Nobody had to sacrifice their personal life to keep things running. I still worked hard. I still cared deeply about doing excellent work. But I'd learned to care about myself and my family too. That wasn't selfishness. It was sustainability. One evening, as Emma and I worked on her advanced coding project together, she asked me about work. So, you're like, actually in charge now. She was building a simple game in Python, and I was helping her debug a particularly tricky loop. I've always been doing important work. It just took them a while to formally recognize it. Is that why you were working so much before? To prove you were important. Smart kid? She'd always been perceptive. Even when she was little, I remembered how she used to wait by the window for me to come home, how her face would fall when I called to say I'd be late again. Yeah, I think so. But I learned something valuable. The people who matter will see your worth without you having to sacrifice everything to prove it. And the people who can't see it, what about them? Well, sometimes you have to step back and let them discover what they're missing. But also, sometimes you have to accept that not everyone will recognize your value. And that's okay. The most important thing is that you know your own worth. She thought about that for a moment while debugging her code. So it's like, don't work yourself to death for people who don't appreciate you. Something like that. Work hard for the right reasons, for your own growth, for people who genuinely support you, for the work itself. Not just to prove something to people who refuse to see. She nodded seriously, the way she always did when she was really processing something. Thanks, Dad. I'll remember that. As I watched my daughter work through her Python functions with the same methodical approach I'd tried to teach her, I realized that the best response to being undervalued isn't anger or resentment. It's demonstrating your worth so clearly that it becomes impossible to overlook. But more than that, it's knowing your own worth, regardless of whether others see it. It's building a life that matters to you, not just a career that impresses others. It's being present for the people who actually love you, not just available for the people who need your expertise. The director promotion came with recognition, authority, and the ability to build systems that would help other people advance instead of getting stuck like I had. I used that authority to create pathways for talented people who might otherwise be overlooked, to build processes that didn't require anyone to be a hero, to develop the next generation of leaders properly, with mentorship and training and time to grow. But the real victory was simpler than that. I was finally being seen for what I'd always been capable of, and I was home every night to help my daughter with her homework, to hear about her day, to be the father she deserved. The relationship with Emma transformed. She started telling me about her problems, her friendships, her dreams for the future, things she'd stopped sharing when I was always distracted, always exhausted, always thinking about the next work crisis. I got to be her dad again, not just the tired guy who paid the bills and occasionally appeared at dinner. Looking back, I'm grateful for that conversation with David, not because he was right, but because he forced me to see something I'd been avoiding. I had been complicit in my own exploitation. I had enabled a system that used my dedication against me. I had chosen work over family for years, telling myself it was noble sacrifice, when really it was fear. Fear that if I wasn't indispensable, I wasn't valuable. That was the real lesson. Your value doesn't come from being irreplaceable. It comes from what you build, who you help, how you live. The people who love you don't need you to be a hero. They just need you to be present. If you've ever felt invisible at work, despite doing excellent work, remember this: your value doesn't disappear just because others can't see it. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is stop making their blindness your problem and start making your worth impossible to ignore. But also remember, this proving yourself to the wrong people is a game you can never win. Know your worth, demand your value, and save your best energy for the people and purposes that actually deserve it. Your career matters, but it's not everything. Your family needs you present, not just providing. Your life needs you engaged, not just exhausted. Don't sacrifice everything for people who will replace you without a second thought. You deserve better than that. We all do. Hit that like button if this story resonated with you. Subscribe for more stories like this, and drop a comment sharing your own experience with workplace recognition. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.